Hello and good day, folks. Welcome to Marriage and Family, and I am your professor for the semester, Professor Stewart. And I am formerly an associate professor of sociology at Mott Community College. And so that's a fancy way of saying that I've been at the college for 16 years now. So we're here to look at the structure and the ultimate function of marriage and family within society. But before we get into that, and as you can imagine, of course, we're going to talk about our own experiences with respect to marriage and family throughout the semester. I want to offer you a bit of my own unique personal perspective. I am married, I do have a child, so indeed, in addition to that personal framework of being married and having my own family, I also have come from such. For a time, I grew up in a married couple family, but the majority of my growing up was as a single, or within, I should say, the majority of how I grew up was within a single parent family with my mother as the head of the household. And so many of you are going to have similar kinds of thoughts, experiences, and musings considering your family and your past and present state of family in your life. So a lot of that is going to be a big part of the grist for the mill that is the course, so to speak. So we need to talk about a few things just to sort of get our sea legs and just to get ready and get comfortable with respect to what the course is all about. We need to talk ultimately about what marriage and family is with respect to the discipline of sociology. So marriage and family is ultimately an attempt to understand families. Sociology, it's been said, is not a practice, it's really an attempt to understand. And so we're looking at marriage and family as a series of systems that we're ultimately, as sociologists and you as sociologists in training, are going to try to and attempt to understand. And so in understanding it, we get a sense of ultimately how it impacts society and how it impacts our lives as individuals. We get a sense of, well, what does family do individually? What does it do for us personally, but also what does it do for society? What impact does it have ultimately on society and social relationships? One thing I've said over the years, over and over again, particularly in the teaching of another course, Human Sexuality, is that society is in your relationships. It's not just you and your family members alone, that your relationships are circumscribed by, they're surrounded by society, and ultimately they are mediated or influenced. That's a fancy way of saying it. They're influenced by society. And a lot also of how we ultimately experience quote-unquote society is by really what happens in our families. And so within the family unit itself is where we really initially typically experience society and what a society is really all about. A big part of what marriage and family is going to be is talking about the social history of marriage and family in our country, the social history of marriage and family throughout the United States, and also some of the social history that ultimately was borrowed or attached to us in a sense with respect to European colonization and European settlement of the United States. And we'll certainly look at the core traditions of Latin American roots and traditions, African American roots and traditions, as well as Native American roots and traditions as well, and look at the blending and the melding of such within our society. We'll also, in talking about marriage and family, we'll be looking in a sense at the way we never were, and that's a great quote from a book title by the preeminent marriage and family historian Stephanie Coontz. She wrote a great book called The Way We Never Were. This is one of those classes, this is one of those topics that can be kind of loaded, and people say often when they talk about families today, or they talk about past families, they'll say, well, back in the day this, or, in those days that. Some of that can and often is true. But at the same time, most of us are not truly committed to the study of the history of marriage and family. And so historians like Stephanie Coontz have done a great job for us and help dispel a lot of the false ideas and really expose the truth of what marriage and family is ultimately about. And so what this class does and what sociology ultimately does is it really holds up a mirror to society. It's a way to sort of look in real time at, well, what is the state of marriage and family today? What is the state of family and familial relationships today? How are we individually impacted by families? How do we see family reflected in the economy, reflected in the workplace, reflected in the military, reflected in the criminal justice system and the law enforcement system? How do these other additional groupings and institutions, how do they reinforce a lot of our notions and values of what family ultimately is? And so we'll be exploring that. And so that gives you a good sense, a good smattering, if you will, of what marriage and family as a subject matter ultimately is and what it's about. Now, if we're talking about really ultimately what marriage and family is, we certainly have to conversely talk about what marriage and family is not. We've got to talk about those kinds of things. And again, so as we're getting started, we're clarifying and we're really trying to say, okay, here are truly the conceptual academic boundaries of the course and how we can apply them. So in a lot of respects, keep this in mind. This is going to be very important because we're going to be talking about a lot of loaded topics, a lot of very sensitive and controversial ones. Keep in mind, number one, that marriage and family is not therapy. We're not offering any kind of therapeutic or counseling interventions. We certainly can offer information that can provide or be construed, if you will, as advice on the practice of therapy, the practice of counseling. It certainly can be ways to inform such practices, and typically that's how therapeutic interventions are ultimately based. They're based in some sort of knowledge base or knowledge collection. They're based in some sort of data collection and empirical evidence. So while what we're doing is evidence-based and is again holding up that mirror to society and getting and collecting and explaining the evidence, when it really comes down to it, therapy and counseling are best left to therapy and counseling professionals, psychologists, psychiatrists, clinical social workers, counseling psychologists, and the like. It's really their purview, and it's really what they should do separate from this. Again, a lot of what we're going to talk about, though, is going to be consistent with much of their practice. And so what we're doing is much more theoretical, where we're asking the larger questions about marriage and family within society. And again, practitioners have the room and the space to do their own work right there in the heart of the game, the core of it, if you will, almost like a referee sort of looking at the game as it's going on. Again, we're also not social work. Marriage and family is not social work. Social work is a set of principles and organizations organized around meeting basic human needs: food, clothing, shelter, social support, emotional support. Incredibly wonderful and worthwhile work, and a lot of it, in terms of how it's applied, does follow many of the notions and many of the findings of sociologists. And so, again, while sociology can work and often does sort of walk in tandem with sociology can walk in tandem and work with social work. At the same time, social work is the practice of meeting basic human needs and prioritizing those in a large, diverse, complex society. Again, we're asking the larger questions about a lot of social processes within our society, including how we actually provide a lot of those basic needs and get those basic needs met. So we're a closely aligned field to social work, but indeed sociology is a separate field, so to speak. Keep in mind also, marriage and family is not about morality. It's not about fairness. It's not about right or wrong. It's not about good or bad per se in its purest form. It's not about the best or worst families, the best or worst mothers, the best or worst fathers, the best or worst children. It's not about those things. We're not really here to make value judgments. We're here to, again, be value-free and judgment-free as a zone. But we're clarifying ultimately what is the state today of marriage and family within the United States. And again, what are the implications of that, if you will, not only for individual families, but for the entire society going forward. All right, some other things. The course will provide the following: It will be a, again, non-judgmental view of families. We will be humanistic in our viewpoint of families. And so we'll look at, again, ways that families, but also the individuals therein, are trying to be and accomplish and do their very best. And so that is ultimately what we're talking about. Keep in mind, this class, even though it's not therapy, it's not offering a therapeutic sort of lens per se. Again, this is really about learning about families in a way that we can offer some useful tips. There will be some provision of that. There will be some ability to offer some tips. Again, not therapy, not counseling, not social work, but some basic core ideas that can be incredibly effective as principles for sustaining families as a mindset. And again, not what practitioners do, but an overall sort of approach that people may benefit from and use as tips to create a sustaining family. Obviously, this is going to help you get your degree or your certificate. Within, for instance, early childhood, a number of you are taking the course per the Early Childhood Education Associate in Applied Science for that degree, or for the Infant and Toddler Certificate. So hello and welcome. And also to sociology majors, psychology majors and minors, and other interested social science students, and those who are interested in a liberal arts credit for the semester. All right. So here are some things we're going to be looking at throughout the semester. Starting with the first chapter, we have to talk about the sociology, ultimately, of family, just to begin with. We can think of a family, here's a good rough definition. A family is a group of related people that are bound by the following connections ultimately recognized by society. Again, these are a group of related persons that are connected in a way that is socially recognized and socially constructed. So ultimately, society is what deems family significant. That it's not enough to just say, "Hey, we're a family." We have to be circumscribed by or surrounded by, in a context of people who validate our sense of being connected in a biological sense, legal sense, and an emotional sense. So it's not about simple self-determination of, hey, this is the Smith family, or this is the Johnson family, or the Stewart family. It's, hey, do other people also say that you're a family? Do they agree that indeed that's who and what you are? And so again, families are ultimately in a social space that is socially constructed and socially mediated. So by mediated, it's influenced by society. So again, although this is a sort of tried and true definition within the marriage and family realm, we do have to sort of break that down a bit. It may seem to sum up many different kinds of families, if not all. It does not settle sometimes the disagreement over how much each of these connections matters. It doesn't make all families immediately recognizable. So nevertheless, though, families have emotional connections and emotional connectedness, right? So family for most people means some sort of long-term commitment. We're looking at hugs. We're looking at people who care for us, who ask about how we're doing. We're looking at those lifelong primary group relationships. Excuse me, for a lot of you who've had the Intro to Sociology course. With the primary group relationships, we're talking about those that we have a great loyalty to, that are meant to be lifelong, intimate face-to-face connections. And so ultimately we think of our families when we think of that these are for all time ways within which we are socialized, and we are connected to society emotionally through our family members. Families, of course, also define legally and are legally connected. There is a process where we're taught, expected, and forced to follow social norms. We call that process social control. And a lot of this comes from the deviance sub-area of sociology. And so deviance looks at how we may and often do not follow social norms, but the vast majority of the time we are following norms. And again, we have that social control really to thank for that. So we're taught to follow the rules, we're expected to follow the rules, and we're forced to follow the rules. And ultimately, we're talking about the rules that society expects us to adhere to. we get that rule following process going, the teaching of that starts ultimately within the family, and it's one of the biggest jobs and responsibilities within the family. We accommodate, and again, a lot of this starts with family. We accommodate laws that concern direct, dependent, and child care, that go beyond the institutions of the economy and education. So the economy does one thing in terms of providing goods and services, right? Jobs, if you will, shopping experiences and the like, for instance. Education provides knowledge that is sufficient for life and that meets a common good and a public good. Those are great, but we don't get hugs and kisses. We don't get emotional support from the economy. We don't get emotional support from education institutions. We need another institution within that realm, and so that's ultimately what we get. But at the same time, those emotional connections are, again, surrounded by legal limits and legal parameters and legal guidance. So, also in terms of family, we have to look at it biologically. So-called blood relationships and blood relatives. These are often assumed to be a quick reference to family and what family is, to be sort of a way to sum up family. But at the same time, there are other forms of kin. There are fictive kin. People who are really close to the family that aren't necessarily and typically are not biologically related. So growing up, Aunt Tish, my mom's best friend, for instance, yes, indeed, we thought of her as a beloved aunt, even though we weren't and aren't biologically related. But again, family toggles through many different kinds of defining characteristics. And so biology matters, and we know it does matter, and it is recognized ultimately legally, but at the same time, there are limits even to legality, and legal and biological considerations don't fully accommodate or approximate every individual family. So think about it. Families, therefore, are groups of people that are related, representing a range of biological, legal, and emotional connections that are recognized by society and that are deemed socially significant. So it's not enough to, again, individually as a unit of family to think of yourself as such. It has to be ultimately surrounded by society. Society has to sort of reinforce that sense of, hey, we are a family. And so we're looking at a mutually reinforcing system where you think of yourself as a family, you think of yourselves, if you will, your family unit, as connected as family. And again, that recognition is also, if you will, given by society. You're regarded as such by society in a legal sense, particularly. And so we'll be looking at that more closely as well. And that gets us to the point of the social significance of family and sort of the place of family in society. We have to talk about the state. And so the book does mention this a lot, the state. Sociologists sometimes lap into this discussion of the state. You might think, well, what's the state? Why are they saying that? I live in Michigan. I know what the state is. Well, when we're looking at state, in this sense, we're talking about the government and the different levels of government being sort of the state. And so, again, families exist in this government space. We exist in a space of the state. And so again, that's a big arm of society, a big aspect of society and social institutions. So we know government at all levels affects families directly through legal definition. So who can be defined as a family, how families are regulated. So who is and what kinds of people within society are recognized as being in a family or being able to create a family. Who can marry, for instance, and how are societal rewards distributed. Tax breaks and tax benefits, they're not just given, they're not just put out there, they're socially constructed and they're socially defined. Families get tax breaks and tax benefits because we as a state, as a set of governments, have construed family as being important and useful and critical for society. And so as the state regards family, the idea is, well, if we take care of families, we're taking care of society. And so we get that reciprocity, those mutually reinforcing relationships between government at all levels and between individual family units. But it's not all about the government. We also have the economy. We have the market. And so when we talk about the market, particularly in social science and sociology, we're talking about the economy. We're talking about how we get stuff, how we get lawn care services, how we get a job, how we even volunteer. A lot of these things take place in a market. So we're looking at the economy, the job market, work, goods and services, finance, and the wealth experience. The where and the how of work, how much we make, where our family's economy is ultimately determined by these layers. This further impacts and further reinforces family relationships and the choices that are made within the family. All right, so that was a lot. Hope it wasn't too overwhelming. That's one of the good things about this being on video, is that yes, you can say, okay, if he talks too fast, you can always go back and take a look at it, maybe rather a few more times. I will try to slow down as much as I can. I have heard over the years that I do talk kind of fast when I'm teaching. All right, so we can't only look at the institutions and the definition. We've also got to look at ultimately what are the theories about family and how are families explained theoretically. What are some ways that we can sort of understand families? And so when we're looking at theory, think of theory as a way to explain something. Think of theory as a way to understand something. And so that's ultimately what theory is about. A way to explain the data that we collect. And data collection is key to sociology and key to the study of marriage and family. We're not simply going off of what we think families are like or what we assume families to be like. We're looking directly at the data. We're holding up that mirror to society, and that mirror process is the data capturing. And so theories help us explain the data that we find out about marriages and about families. We've got a couple of sort of older school classic theories within sociology. And again, if you've had the Introduction to Sociology class, you probably have heard about this before. We have functional theory to start with. And this is the oldest theory, if you will, within sociology. What we sometimes refer to this as is the consensus perspective. And so functional theory really looks at how parts come together to create a whole, how society has cohesive groups and cohesion and tightness and connection within it. So a lot of the early functional theorizing grew out of biology, which basically said, okay, if biology explains organisms that have lungs, hearts, livers, and so forth, body parts that are connected, we could also say the same thing about society. And so that's ultimately what the functionalist perspective says. So it says that families are an example of shared norms and values, how we collectively express those within society. That order is at the core of society, and so with this way of looking at things, there's always the strong likelihood and reality of order, of purpose, of structure, of whatever exists having a purpose. And if things don't work out, or if they're not necessary to society, if they're not necessary to the family, for instance, they're sort of weeded out. And the more important kinds of functions do not only surface, but they really, really take shape and they dominate. And so the idea here from this functional theory is that order is at its core. Order in society is at the core of society, and families are a reflection of the order. And so families reflect, in a sense, the stability that we have in society. They reflect the stability of society, and families are a stabilizing influence in societies as well. Going on, this way of thinking says traditional sex roles for straight relationships and families, where you've got the father in the workforce, the homemaker mother, and again, we're looking at really old ways of sort of thinking about society and theory. This sort of way said, all right, the traditional notions of family and how they're constructed, with the father as the breadwinner, with the mother as the homemaker in a straight family, that these are seen as stabilizing families and society at the same time. Obviously, this is a controversial viewpoint to truly, ultimately stick to. Most, if you will, thoughts of society that are functionalist based are not necessarily meant to truly preserve a traditional notion of what family is all about. And again, we'll look at what Stephanie Coontz also is found in her work, and that a lot of this notion of breadwinner father, homemaker mother, a lot of this is also a reflection of what we never were as well, at least through the majority of our time. Functionalism has not been as readily embraced in recent decades within sociology and related disciplines because it doesn't really explain a lot of what happens in society. And so when there's significant disorder in society, when there's significant disorders in families, the functionalists couldn't really explain it. You couldn't just say, oh, it'll work itself out. You can't just say that. You can't just say that wars will work themselves out. You can't just say gender inequality is going to work itself out. No, these are heavily, deeply entrenched problems. And so functionalist theory doesn't fully get around to explaining how that stuff ultimately works out. It can recognize that it's dysfunctional, but beyond that, it's got problems really trying to explain what it does ultimately for society. You can only have so much dysfunction with respect to stabilizing society and keeping it stable, but you can only have so much dysfunction too from a theoretical standpoint for the functionalists to be able to explain. If there's too much, that theory doesn't really offer that much of an explanation. That brings us to another classic, older school way of looking at things that is more commonly still associated with sociology today, and that brings us to conflict theory. And so conflict theory assumes that in any society there is going to be conflict between different groups within society that have their own unique interests. And so the conflict occurs over the scarce resources that happen and that exist within society. Money, power, jobs, respect, health insurance, affordable housing, decent neighborhoods. These are things that are not available in abundance, that we all don't have equal access to. And so conflict theory really within sociology and certainly within marriage and family really grew a lot during the 60s and 70s, during the equality movements within our society, because the conflict theory and related theories became more important and seen as greater ways of explaining a lot of the inherent tension that exists within a society as large and as diverse as ours. So in terms of families, from the conflict point of view, families, they collectively express opposition, opposing forces, and inequality within society. Each family has unique individuals, just like society. There's tension within the family, in addition to the tension that exists within society. And again, a lot of the tension that we ultimately see happening in society, a lot of that does boil over from families. And also there's that additional reciprocal kind of relationship, that the tension we see happening in society also gets foisted upon the family and can get absorbed and reflected and replicated within the family as well. So in a way, you can see conflict in society as being an expression of conflict within family and vice versa. All right, so those are two ways that we can look at family and marriage in society. There are some others that have also emerged more recently and that are used by a number of different kinds of researchers and scholars. The first being feminist theory, and feminist theory is also very aligned with conflict theory and how conflict theory explains things. And so feminist theory immediately looks at gender inequality and how gender is a system of dominance that has been perpetuated over and over again by white male patriarchy in particular. So feminist theory seeks to identify, understand, and reduce inequality between men and women. Male dominance is not natural, it's not inevitable. It's not just the natural order of things. Male dominance and patriarchy is a social construction. It's a social expectation, again, though, that is ultimately embedded within society and how it functions. Excuse me. So male dominance in marriage, if we're looking at straight marriage in particular historically and also into the present, it's consistent with male dominance in society. Both should be resisted. Feminism determines also that gender inequality within family is reinforced by what we call anticipatory socialization. So how we teach young boys and young girls, how we teach them for later roles and statuses. That's really anticipatory socialization. What we teach them about work, what we teach them about the roles that they'll have in families, in the community, what we teach them about the kinds of jobs that they'll have, who's listened to and how much, and who gets to speak their mind without prompting, those kinds of things. That level of socialization, so to speak, if you will, reinforces gender inequality, because how we socialize boys and girls is very different. Even linguistically, linguistics researchers have shown, those who study language, they've shown, for instance, that boys and girls are raised in entirely different subcultures from a language point of view. Language, we know, is power, and that's also studied by feminism and feminist theory as well. And then there's another theory that comes along and says, hey, we have to look at things in a cost-benefit analysis, that it isn't just that one side rather gains and the other side loses. It isn't just a zero-sum game. That's what we call that, when there's one winner and then everybody else loses. And so exchange theory comes along and reminds us that, quite frankly, families are an arena of exchange, that we barter within families, that we share within families just like we share within society. We get into relationships in a way to maximize